Hi guys, thanks for joining me to paint this lobster and starfish. Since I did take some time fine-tuning the sketch of my lobster on the actual rock, copying the one that I had originally sketched on paper, I did want to show you that I basically did shapes for the lobster, and then I just did some erasing and fine-tuning of those shapes to create the actual lobster. Here you see the sketch of the lobster. I did ovals for the body and the claws, little kidney shapes for the tail, and kind of football shapes connected to each other for the legs. And now I'm back, and that is the sketch that I originally did on paper and copied it onto the rock. Like I said, the lobster I did off camera. Those stars are the starfish, believe it or not, just 5 pointed stars. And now I'm going to show you how I turned those into the starfish. Real simple, just make your basic 5 pointed star, and then at each of the points we're going to round it and curve it a little bit to give it the legs of the starfish. And then once we have each point rounded and curved any which way, because the starfish are kind of swimming and floating along in the ocean, then we're just going to erase the interior of the star, leaving us with our outline of a starfish instead of our 5 pointed star. All right, now move on to the next star and magically turn it into a starfish with curves and rounding a little bit, and then just erasing our lightly sketched 5 pointed star interior. That's it. Pretty basic. And then we'll add our little bit of detail with some dotting and then some micro dotting for our outline, a little bit darker color shades of the starfish to create some shadow or underside of the starfish. But that's basically it for the starfish. It's pretty straightforward. Moving on to the third and final one, the bigger one that is kind of in the foreground. Rounding it out, curving it a little bit at each point, and then erasing our interior. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of create a, for lack of a better word, an echoed line at each of those legs of the starfish. And that's where we will put in our darker shade to give it a little bit of shading, a little bit of dimension. So I'm just bringing those points out a little bit further, fine-tuning the legs. That soft makeup brush is what helps me get rid of the eraser shavings without smearing the pencil. And now we're coming in, and I'm going to do that wider line at each point of the leg. That will be where I put our darker color. That'll be coming a little bit further on in the video. All right, that's giving it a little bit more depth already, and we haven't even added our color yet. Take your time with this pencil sketching part. Make it what you want before you go to this next stage of adding color. Now we're going to add a base color, and quite often, I use the acrylic paint straight out of a Posca pen. I like the consistency. I can layer it up. It's highly pigmented, so it gives good color, and that's what I'm doing here. As opposed to other videos where I've diluted the acrylic paint from the paint pen, I did not dilute it for this rock, not for this base coating. So I'm just quickly going to speed this up a little bit for you, and I'm adding the red as our base coat for the lobster. I'm going to alternate sections of the lobster with adding the color so that I can let each section dry in between and leave enough separation between the sections, because I'm going to want to be able to ascertain where those separations are when I'm going to be coming back in with micro dotting and with shading. So I'm moving around the lobster. That's why you're not seeing me jump right into the tail off of the body. I instead jumped up to the claw, giving that body time to dry. I pointed out the brush I used there was a small filbert, and it is a size 4, and it gets in there pretty nicely. I like using this brush. Got this at Hobby Lobby. So I'm still leaving a little tiny bit of space in between each of those sections of the tail, just so I know where I'm going to be adding my shading and my highlighting, and it doesn't just all blend together, because a lobster is kind of segmented. And I am painting right over those pencil marks. I will not have to erase any of these pencil marks. You'll see there's no point in this video where we have to erase any pencil, which is kind of cool. I came in now with a much finer brush. This is what's called a spotter brush, 20/0. I wish I knew what that meant. I'm not an artist. I'm not trained anyway. I'm self-taught, so I don't know what that means. All I know is it's a really fine brush. Also got this at Hobby Lobby. They had a sale a few weeks back, 30% off, and snatched up a few of these good brushes that have been added to my favorites. And I'm just using this spotter brush or fine liner, and I filled in all those little connected football shapes for the segmented little legs on the side, the antenna. And now I'm taking a darker shade of red, and we're going to begin adding our shadowing. And I take a little bit of that darker red, mix in our OG red, the first red, and get it just a little bit of a shade darker. And I'm coming around the edge of the body and putting it right over that base coat. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking some of that OG red, the first red, and I'm blending the darker one into the lighter one. The paint's wet right now, so it's hard to see that it blended a little bit better than it looks when it's wet like that. But you'll see as we keep going on with our blending and shading and highlighting on this lobster, it all comes together. Turn the lobster around, I'm doing the same exact thing on the other side, and I'll be continuing to do the same thing on all parts of the lobster. And again, I'm bouncing around on different parts of the lobster because I'm giving it time to dry before I add my next layer. That way the paint won't pull up if I try to layer too quickly on some wet paint. Now I'm taking a little bit of black. A lot came out, but I'm not going to be using a lot. And I'm mixing a tiny bit of that black into our darker shade that we created with the OG and the darker shade of red. And I'm just dotting a little bit of it in, tapping it off, and then with the water, I'm going to continue to blend that blackish red into the darker red, which then blends into the OG red. Using the water to help me blend it. Daubing off if I have too much water. I always keep a Q-tip on hand to soak that up, and a paper towel, and my fingers, because you end up soaking up water with whatever you have available. Doing the same thing on the other side of the lobster body, and just continuing to blend it. I won't know if it's exactly how I want it to be until after each section is dry. So as I go through the process of this lobster and parts of it dry, I'm going to come back, add a little bit more of maybe the OG color to lighten it, maybe the darker red with the OG to give it a little bit more of that shade, maybe a little bit more of the black one. But you let it dry in between coats and just adapt it to the way you need that shading and highlighting to be. We'll do more highlighting with a lighter Posca pen, a beige color. We'll do that in a little bit, but this is mainly the shading part. The lighter red does give us some highlighting, but we'll add a little bit more to it. There's that beige that I was talking about. I haven't moved on to the fan part of the tail yet because I'm still waiting for all of this to dry completely, and I don't want it to dry completely until I've blended in a little bit of this highlighting. And the highlighting is going to give the body a little bit more dimension, a little bit more of a shape instead of being so flat. And I'm using that filbert brush again to go in and add that highlight with the beige. I do mix the beige a little bit with the OG red first, and then I'll come back over it with just the straight up beige. Just dabbing it on, keeping it in the center part. I don't want the highlight to go all the way out to where the shading is because we want that shading to stay intact. So I'm keeping the highlighting part more on the center part of each segment of the tail and or the body. When we get to the claws, same thing with the claws, because that's where the light would hit first. That gives it that rounded shape a little bit more. Daubing off a little bit too much water and adding a little bit more of that beige now. And we're just going to keep adapting it until we're happy with it. I'm waiting for it to dry, and now I'll move on to that fan part, doing the exact same technique we did before with the darker red, the lighter red, mixing them a little bit together to get an in-between shade. And then adding it to the edges, blending it in toward the center. Now I can go back since that's dry, and I'm adding a little bit more of that beige because I want a little bit more highlighting right down the center of the lobster. Always put your lid on your pen, otherwise it splatters like it just did. There we go. It's getting a little bit more rounded with each layer that we're giving to the shading and the highlighting. And don't worry if you have too much water. The water really does help to blend on this technique, but having that Q-tip handy is important because sometimes there's just a little bit too much water on your brush and it helps you just soak it up. Now on this fan part of the tail, I'm doing little swoosh marks with the beige, not mixed with the red, just the straight up beige. And I'm adding those swoosh marks knowing that I'm going to come back in and blend over part of them with the red so they are not as pronounced as they look at this beginning stage of it. But again, we'll have to let each layer dry in between. This is a longer video and I'm sorry about that, but I'm kind of not sorry about it. It's not longer because it's difficult. It's longer because there are a lot of steps. They're simple steps though. There's just dry time waiting and we're doing a mixed media rock. And with mixed media, you know, you're going to have a period of time that you're doing your acrylic, and then in this case, then our alcohol ink, and then our foils. So there are stages to this rock, which makes the video take a little bit longer, but it is a pretty simple rock. Now I'm coming in with that spotter, that really fine liner brush again, and I'm going to use that on the tentacles and the legs. I'm just adding that darker red on one side of each of those jointed legs just to give it a little bit of a shade. And I don't do any other blending on the legs. It doesn't really need it. And we'll be coming back in with micro dotting to do our outlining instead of a really sharp edged line. So it will kind of make any of those, I don't want to say lines, but any of those hard spots of the shaded area softened up a little bit. The black micro dots really do an amazing job softening it, so you'll see it blend much more after we get to that part of the video. Again, just little teeny tiny lines of that darker red right on those legs. Barely there. Now I'm coming back in with that beige again. and I'm going to add a little bit of highlighting to our claws. It's amazing how quickly it just gives it a little bit more of a three-dimensional shape as opposed to just one-dimensional. He's coming together. Now that that beige on the fan part of the tail has dried, I'm coming back in with a little bit darker red and making them just kind of blend a little bit better. We just want little tiny hints of highlighting there. Okay, now I'm going to take a dotter, and I'm not dotting the eyes. I'm using the dotter to just create circles, black circles for the eyes. I didn't want it mounded like I would normally do with dotting. I just want to apply the paint as if the dotter is a brush and create a precise circle of an eye right there. Now we'll finish them off, like I said, with the micro dotting. Right now all I'm going to do is take a diluted black and I'm going to lightly go around those antennae. So they're not just red lines, but they're actually shaded a little bit with a very, very thin line of the black. I'm testing out the thickness of the line and the consistency of the paint on my glass below, and now I'm applying it to the sides. Just makes it pop out a little bit more. There we go. All right, now we're going to add our color to our starfish. I chose a few shades of orange. The first starfish is going to be a very, very pale yellowy orange, and then the one that's off on the right side of the rock, lower right side, will be a darker orange. This yellowy orange one is a little bit thin. I might have had a little bit too much water in the bristles of my brush, and I'm using a very, very small angled flat brush for these starfish. But I will have to add another coat to that because it was a little bit thinner, and all that pencil will miraculously disappear with our coats of paint as well as with our micro dotting. You'll see it go away, don't worry about that. And these starfish in the early stages of us painting them look a little cartoony. We'll make them a little less cartoony. I mean, it's definitely not a realism rock, but it won't be quite so SpongeBob SquarePants when we get done with it. It may be a bit ugly before it gets pretty, but it will get pretty. There's that darker orange I was talking about that I'm going to use to give a little bit dimension to those thicker penciled marks that we added to our starfish back in the beginning. Remember that? How I went back over and added another pencil line? That's where I'm adding this darker orange right now. Right over the pencil. I promise you won't see it when we're done. Promise, cross my heart. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other two starfish. One is going to be a lighter kind of turquoisey blue with a darker blue line for the shadowing. And then the other will be a darker orange with, yeah, it's actually a coral. The body of the other starfish is more of a coral color with that same darker color that I'm using right now of the orange on the coral one. Okay, now we'll come in with the aqua. See, they call this, just to make sure I give you the right name. Yep, it's aqua. You never know, but yes, they call it aqua. Posca. Posca aqua. That sounds funny. Again, using that flat angled brush, a small one. Now we'll take that darker blue and add a shade line on each of the legs. And I mixed that darker blue, as I did with the orange, I forgot to mention that. I mixed it with the first color so it's kind of an in-between shade. So that's mixed with a little bit of aqua to give that color. And with the side of that small angled flat brush, you can really get a pretty good thin line. So I didn't even have to switch over to that daughter or disposable eyeliner brush. As long as you use a light touch, you can get a pretty thin line. Now I'm doing the coral for the body of this starfish. And then I'll mix a little bit of the orange with the coral to do the shadow line. I just hit it with the blow dryer really quickly just for the sake of the video because there was a little bit more water on my brush. But the Poscas really do dry fairly quickly. So I did a second coat on that coral because it was a little thin. So all of these components really do have 2, sometimes 3, 4, 5 coats, especially on the lobster where there's the shadowing and the highlighting. There are a lot of layers on there. And there are at least 2 to 3 on the starfish as well. That's really going to give you that nice pop of color using more than just one coat. Now we mixed a little bit of the coral with the orange and we're doing our shadow lines. Again, cartoony now, possibly even a little bit ugly, but micro dotting will do an amazing job finishing these off. Second coat on that shadow line for our first starfish. I remember going to SeaWorld a lot when I was little, and all the starfish they had there were the colors of these two ones that are on the bottom. Every now and then you'd see a blue one, and we thought it was so special. So those are the colors I chose for these starfish. Okay, now I'm just taking a really small dotting tool, and with an ultra aqua, or a marine blue we'll call it. It can be any dark shade blue. This is called ultramarine by Shuttle Art, but you can use any acrylic paint. And I'm just walking really tiny dots on each of the legs of the starfish and doing a couple more little tiny dots in the center. Just walking the dots. And always check out the size of your dots with your tool off to the side, just to make sure you're not going to come down with too big of a dot that's going to take over. So that's what I did, those little tiny dots that are on the side on my glass. That's what I was doing over there. Now I'm taking an orange by Apple Barrel called Harvest Orange. Any darker color orange will do. And I'm doing the same thing on the other two starfish. Walking the dots down on each leg, adding a couple extra little tiny dots within the body, and that's it. This isn't the micro dotting I was talking about. That's yet to come with some black Tule Art fine liners. But these dots are what really make them look like starfish instead of just wonky five-pointed rounded stars. And I'm letting the walking dot line curve with the curve of each leg instead of it being perfectly straight. All right, now we've got those little dots on our starfish. Moving on to the next part is the Tule Art fine liners. I used a 10 for the lobster, and I used an 08 for the stars. So two different size. And these micro dots, I'm not staying in a consistent straight line. I'm kind of dotting back and forth, but keeping it right along that edge. And it's just adding another dimension of shading and a softer dimension than one straight line would be around the body. I like this dotting technique because it's just very fluid with the body itself, with the shading that we already put down with our darker red and our black mixed with our base red. Back and forth, kind of random. Go out of line, go out of your straight line mentality and make them a little scattered, but in a controlled, smaller space. I hope that made sense. And then we're going to continue it and do it at each jointed part, each segment of the lobster. And we'll add a couple random dots on each section, because those lobsters have little black dots on them. And I know they're not usually as red when they're swimming in the ocean. That usually happens after they're in a pot of boiling water. but they're prettier when they're red, so I did make them a little bit more red than they may be in the ocean. Artist liberties, right? Those little black dots, it always amazes me how they really just bring it to life, really bring the shading the way we want it to be. It's kind of like pointillism, where you're making shapes with tiny dots, kind of like that, but we're not creating the entire shape, we're just creating the dimension of the shading. And I'm doing the same thing on the fan part of the tail. I'm doing that black dotting wherever I had done the white highlighting, not white, the beige, that highlighting, all of those little scallop kind of looking areas, I'm doing with the micro dotting. And the edge of that fan part of the tail will get a nice heavier layer of the micro dotting just to make it a little bit darker. Just makes it pop a little bit more off the rock, kind of brings it up. I'm doing it on each of those segmented legs, and then up onto the claws as well. Even on those little antennae. And at each of the points of the claws, I go a little bit heavier with that micro dotting. So it's almost black at the tips. Like almost like the claw itself is black, not just creating that shadow, but giving the claw a little bit of blackness. And we'll do that same thing with the 08 on the starfish. We're going heavier with the micro dotting up toward the top of each of the points and actually into and over some of that orange. And you're doing it inside of the shadow line and on the outside of the shadow line. That's why I said don't be so worried about the pencil if you see it, because wherever you see that pencil, you're going to be going over it with this micro dotting. It's literally just going to make the pencil disappear. On those points, we're going a little bit heavier. And that just adds to giving the starfish the feeling of a little bit more movement. But it's exactly the same kind of random dotting that we did on the lobster. We're doing the exact same technique on the starfish. Now what I have in my hand there is what's normally a watercolor palette, but I have alcohol inks in there. Another rocker had shared that tip with me, and I find it very helpful. And you just drop your drops of alcohol inks in there, let them get to just the point of being the color, then you can put that palette away and just reactivate it with the alcohol like I have right there. And I just rub the brush that's been wet with the alcohol into the color, and I'm just taking whatever shades of blues and greens and dabbing it on to create the background of our water. They'll all blend together, they'll all end up looking like water when you just randomly use the greens and the blues together. Get a little bit more alcohol, add a little bit more blue. If you feel you're heavy in the greens, add some blues in there. I did do a seal coat of Rust-Oleum 2X on the whole thing after I did the micro dotting, and before coming in with the alcohol ink. So there is a Rust-Oleum seal on that, and then I'm doing the alcohol ink. It makes it very forgiving when I'm getting in up close to the lobster or the starfish, because if I happen to get any of that alcohol ink on them, I could use a Q-tip dipped in alcohol or my finger if I'm fast enough and just rub it right off of either the starfish or the lobster without staining it with that alcohol ink. If I didn't seal it before adding the alcohol ink, I wouldn't be able to do that. Just dabbing it into place. Now that brush I'm using is one that I have dedicated to alcohol ink. Take any of the brushes you're not crazy about and set them aside strictly for alcohol inks, because the alcohol will eat up those brushes and you don't want to use the brushes that you normally use for painting with. So those are dedicated to my alcohol ink paint brush use. Just getting that watercolor all over on all edges of this blemished Santorini. We'll just speed that up a little bit to get through this part. It's amazing how the blues and the greens just end up looking so pretty and blended together, and you really don't even have to pay attention to what colors you're using or which one you're using, and you just go at it. And the way the alcohol inks dry, it gives it that really cool water ocean kind of effect. And I'm able to come up right on top of that lobster. Just be very, very careful when I get to the lobster. But because I have that Rust-Oleum 2X sealer on there, I'm not worried about ruining what I already did with my artwork. Coming in close, and then if you don't like the brush strokes that you're getting by coming in close, after you have it all done, just dip your brush in only the alcohol ink and lightly daub on top of those brush strokes to give it that more mottled effect. I'll go at a little bit of lightning speed right now just to get through this part. It's getting there. And that's the other nice thing about these alcohol inks. If you don't like the way a first layer is, add another layer. Just add a little bit more green if it's too blue. Add a little bit more blue if it's too green. And the way they'll all blend together, you'll be happy with the result. little bit more alcohol if it's a little too dark, and you can just keep shifting those alcohol inks around on the rock until you're happy with your product. Now I knew that was a little bit too dark, but I just kept going with filling in right around that fantail, and then dip right into your alcohol and blend and smooth it out. I'm painting the base of that rock, even though I really didn't have to because it's a standing rock, so that will be what it's standing on top of, but I did continue it down onto the bottom there. Not necessary, but if you are doing this rock for the plane ride in Shelly's group on Facebook, make sure all visible parts of your rock are painted with these alcohol inks, with the water. Feel free to fast forward through this part even more if you want to. It did take a little bit of time to get this exactly the way I wanted it, even on fast forward. It's a process, but it's not a hard process. It takes a little bit of patience and a little bit of time, but it's not difficult at all, trust me. We're getting closer. The water is taking shape. Now we're going to get into these little tiny detail spots around the legs. Just use the tip of your brush a little bit more. Take your time and be gentle. Throw on some steel drum music or whatever puts you in the water, lobstery, starfish kind of mood, and just go with it. Maybe it's just me, but I keep hearing in my head steel drums and ukuleles. Call me crazy. And I am going much lighter with the alcohol inks in these detail spots, which is giving a little bit more of a brush stroke look than I wanted. So I will come back in right there and darken it up a bit. Now that I know I have the color right around all of those detail spots, I don't have to come exactly on top of it, but I can layer to darken it a little bit so it wasn't so light. And then any spots that I want to touch up, just add a little bit more. Smooth some out, or add a little bit more color here, take away a little bit of color with a little bit of alcohol if it's too dark. Just play with it until you have it the way you want it. Yep, I think I like that. Now we're ready to move on to our next component. Our next component being the kind of seaweed shapes, the area that I'm going to be applying foil to and micro dotting on top of the foil. So just kind of like long leafy little shapes going underneath the starfish and the lobster. Just a few here and there. Total of, I don't think I did more than 6, 7, 8 little leafies, just to add that added dimension that we want. Again, if you're doing this rock for the plane ride for Shelley's group, you can choose either starfish or seaweed to add to your lobster. Unless you're doing the dolphin, of course, which, if that's the case, this tutorial won't help you. Now, I am using, for the outlining of this seaweed stuff, I'm using the Signo 153 gel pen. And I will also be using that same black gel pen to do the micro dotting on top of the foiled seaweed, because it does apply on top of the foil better for me than the Tule art did. And we'll be using a white and a black of the gel pen to create a few little bubbles at the very end. So now that we have our seaweed there, we're going to do the nail foils. This does not have to be a perfect nail foil application. I am not a master at nail foils. That crown belongs to the foiling rock lady, Wanda Rodriguez. If you haven't checked out her videos, you really should, because she is unbelievable. I'm doing a very amateur application of foil, but that's okay, because we are going to be adding micro dotting with that black gel liner that's going to make it all work out. Any imperfections in the foil will not matter, and we're actually going to use them to our advantage, and you will see that on the finished product. Like if there were any bubbles that were left or areas that the foil didn't cover on the edges, that micro dotting made that all go away. So this isn't a foiling video because that's not my forte. So I am having this part on fast forward. But just to let you know how that's applied if you've never seen it done, I'm using a fine, a disposable eyeliner brush from Amazon. Got that tip from Wanda. Thank you, Wanda. And I'm applying the glue. I'm not stabbing at the glue to apply it. I'm just trying to glide it along the shape that I'm filling in first. and make sure there are no bubbles. Of course, I had a few, but it worked for us with this application. And do one of these pieces of seaweed at a time. Then I'm putting it under the UV lamp that's a 60-second cycle. And then we'll apply the foil. I use 3 different foils to do the seaweed. I happen to have these tweezers that have a very soft ball at the bottom, and I rub that on, as well as use my finger to rub it on, and then simply lift that back, and the foil is in place where the foil glue had been applied and cured. I didn't do all of these foils on camera, so I didn't want this video to go on any longer than it already is, so I finished up all of these foils. And then once they were all done, we come back in with our gel pen micro dotting. On that same strip of foil, I was able to get 2 seaweed pieces, seaweed leaves. I don't know what you call them. So there it is with all the foil on. Now I'm adding my bubbles. I have already added the micro dotting to that seaweed also, by the way. Same technique as the other. Now for these bubbles, all I did was a little semicircle with a black, the gel pen. There I'm doing the semicircles. And now I'm just coming in right by the semicircles and adding a full circle of white. Those are my bubbles. Then I put my resin on, my UV resin, cured it, and there we go. Have a great day.